sure, interesting keynote speech. Elise, please.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Urshka, and also thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to do something that is probably quite a broad perspective. I'm going to stage a wide-ranging historical overview of changes in women's work in the textile industry over a long period of time in many parts of the world. As you may know, textile production has been a highly labor-intensive industry throughout history. And even after machines were introduced since the late 18th century, textile producers have always been in need for cheap labor. In most places in time, it was women, and to a lesser extent children, who provided this labor. So an important strategy in the search for cheap labor was also the relocation of the industry to places where labor was even cheaper. And although the latest shift with mass cotton textile production moving from industrial sites in the global north to the global south is relatively well known, earlier shifts have also occurred. And in this lecture, I aim to identify the most important drivers behind these shifts, as well as their consequences for women workers. And this is also what my project, ERC project, entailed. We just started 1 year ago, so I don't have publications yet. So for me, this is also sort of a test of ideas. In doing this, I will look at the process of globalization, but also at other factors, such as the availability or absence of alternatives in the labor market for women to explain these changes. So as a prologue, I'm going to take you very far back in time. The involvement of women in textile production is age-old. Although we do not know exactly when spinning and weaving emerged, archaeological findings point out that around 4000 BCE, already relatively advanced fabrics were produced with the use of primitive tools, such as the distaff, which you see over there, and the spindle for spinning, and the standing loom, which you see over here for weaving. Most of the textile fabrics that were produced from raw materials such as animal hairs or plants such as flax or in warmer climates cotton were spun and woven for own use. Archaeologists and historians agree that it was predominantly women who spun and wove, being part of their many domestic duties. In hunter and gatherer societies, people had mostly covered their bodies with animal hides. But with the emergence of sedentary agriculture, new ways of clothing emerged. In between their work in the fields, or taking care of the animals, as you can see there on the left, women spun thread while walking, and weaving could be done intermittently between the preparation of food or tending to small children. From ancient Greece to pre-colonial Indonesia, women were symbolically depicted as spinners of the thread of life. So there's also a symbolic notion to spinning. In many historical contexts, especially in subsistence economies, the production of food, beverages, and also textiles for home use was thus part of women's daily duties. They produced clothing and textiles for their own households. And this would only start to change when population density increased and opportunities for market exchange and labor specialization emerged. So this is Act 1, the rise of markets. Textiles were in fact one of the first products to be exchanged on markets. At the time of the Roman Empire, for instance, there was already a lively long-distance trade in textiles with the Indian subcontinent and with China. But these were usually luxury goods such as silks, and expensive cottons, because transport was relatively risky and expensive, and only these expensive goods could amount to a real profit because of their high sale value. With the emergence of cities and the rise of local markets in the High Middle Ages, increasing specialization in the more common textiles for daily use also occurred. Within the city walls, specialized weavers and dyers of cloth produced clothes for sale. Interestingly, in many regions of the world, this specialization was followed by a gender-specific labor division, with women spinning and men going into weaving. Male textile producers also often organized themselves in guilds or in other professional associations, from which women were usually excluded. And although the occurrence of textile guilds was most prominent in the highly urbanized parts of Europe, guild-like organizations also emerged in the Ottoman Empire, in China and in Japan. The division of labor with men weaving and women spinning was not everywhere strict, though. In large parts of China and Indonesia, for example, both spinning and weaving remained predominantly women's work. In India, on the other hand, master weavers were generally men, like in Europe, and women spun. And these differences in the sexual division of work, to my idea, can be explained from the fact that in the rural areas of China and the Indonesian archipelago, weaving remained mostly a temporary and a seasonal activity next to agricultural work. Women in principle produced for the household, but they did sell surpluses of cloth on the markets. And on the other hand, in India and in European cities, textile production was much more solely market-oriented. Both in pre-industrial Europe and in India, women did learn the craft of weaving as daughters or wives as weavers, but this was always in an informal way, like in this picture where the wife helps the master weaver. Women were, as I said, usually not admitted to the formal training of guilds, and they were hardly ever recognized as independent weavers in professional organizations. But there were also exceptions to this. For instance, the weavers' widows, who in many European guilds were allowed to join as masters if their husbands had deceased. Apart from the labor division according to gender, there was also an increasing global division of labor regionally in textile production, already in the pre-industrial era. Asian producers mainly made cotton and silk, which in the first era of globalization, from about circa 1500, they increasingly sold on the world market. European trading companies imported more and more cotton from China and India, and the fabrics became increasingly popular all over the world. Not only in Europe, where in Europe itself weavers mainly produced woolen and linen for export production since the Middle Ages, but also in the Americas.
Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry, I was telling that the cotton and silk production was taking place in Asia, and in Europe it was mostly woolen and linen. In the Americas, also cotton and woolen cloth were made, but this was usually not for the world market, for consumption in local markets or domestic consumption. And in Africa, people clothed themselves with hides, bark cloth, or cotton fabrics, but cotton cloths were also imported via Asia, via the Indian Ocean. As I mentioned, handmade textile production is highly labor intensive. Depending on the quality of the fabric, it takes 4 to 8 spinners to provide one hand weaver with sufficient yarn. And already since the Middle Ages, independent weavers and textile merchants found inventive ways to keep labor costs down. Urban weavers employed spinners in the countryside, where nominal wage rates were considerably lower. These rural spinners, they spun in the evenings and winters as a supplement to agricultural work. And they were usually women and children, and they really could be found throughout the world. In the 17th century Dutch Republic, for instance, Tilburg spinners spun wool for weavers in the city of Leiden. 18th century women in the Chinese countryside of Shanxi, that's a province in China, they spun cotton for the city of Xi'an. The same happened, for instance, in early 20th century Egypt, where rural spinners spun for weavers in Cairo, but also for smaller provincial towns. Over time, the distances that yarn traveled became larger. Thus, 18th century Holland towns imported linen thread from Silesia, for instance. Women's wages there were so much lower that they could compensate for the higher transport costs. At the same time, cheap cotton yarn spun by women throughout the Ottoman Empire was transported to the most important industrial cities, such as Istanbul and Cairo. But then, a lot changed. Act 2, industrialization. World trade expanded, and Asian cotton cloth became increasingly wanted by consumers, not only in Europe, as I said, but also in Africa and North America. In the early 18th century, British woolen cloth producers called for protective measures to ban the import of cotton textiles from India, because according to them, it ruined their domestic woolen textile industry. However, as you can see with the rise of fashion and tastes in clothing, the desire for cotton, which is a very nice to wear cloth, of course, was insatiable. Therefore, other ways to be competitive with Asia on the world market were sought. And the solution was found in technology to cut down labor costs. New spinning and weaving machines were invented and introduced, and you can see a couple of examples here. The very famous spinning jenny, which could rise productivity 16-fold. It spread all over the West, and eventually also in Japan in the 19th century. Whereas China and India for centuries had been the global hubs of cotton textile production, this shifted to the West in the 19th century. As a result of mechanization, thousands of female hand spinners lost their employment, mostly in the countryside. Although some of them found work in the new factories, these were generally unmarried young women. Despite the low wages they received, for these girls, a job in the factory was often more attractive than being an even worse paid, and also usually in a power relation with their masters, a domestic servant in a household of others, which was the most common alternative to factory work for these girls. However, in the course of industrialization, with the introduction of new machines, also new gender-specific division of labor emerged in the factories. And more men entered into spinning. Because weaving mechanized several decades later than spinning, some married women in the countryside now started working on the hand looms in their homes. But hand weaving was not enough to provide for all of the former spinners who now were unemployed. Consequently, an important source of additional income was lost for many rural and urban households in parts of Europe. With the rise of the factories, both feminization and masculinization of the labor force took place. The early stages of industrialization are usually associated with women's and children's work. It was believed that their nimble fingers and their more docile attitudes than men made them a perfect labor force for the factories. And we can see this importance of cheap, supposedly submissive labor, not only in the UK, continental Europe and the United States, but also in countries that industrialized later, such as Japan and China. India, however, was markedly different. Here, mostly men migrated from rural areas to work in urban textile factories around the turn of the 20th century. There, jobs that may previously have been done by women were more prone to mechanization than men's jobs. Despite these early attempts at industrialization in the Asian colonies, such as India, world dominance in textile production decisively shifted to the West in this period. The colonial markets in India and Indonesia were flooded by Western factory textiles. In turn, these regions more and more focused on the cultivation of tropical export commodities such as coffee, sugar, and tobacco for the European and American markets. Under the influence of globalization and the revolution in long-distance transport, the divide between the rich, industrialized countries and the poor countries focusing increasingly on agriculture, this is a sugar plantation, widened. And many economic historians have called this process the deindustrialization of the global periphery. Nevertheless, recent research, among others mine, has shown that in many countries in the global south, despite the existing colonial policies and the advantages for these countries and regions of focusing on tropical export products, there was also a great deal of resilience of local textile production, for much longer than was previously thought. Although the factory imports from the West indeed led to a loss of hand spinning in, for instance, colonial Java, local hand weaving and the dyeing of white cloth was actually stimulated by the imports of factory-made yarns and undyed cloth from the West. Actually, Japanese women often took advantage of the fact that the factory yarn, which was imported, was much more even, and that they had to spend less time on the labor-intensive spinning and more on the more profitable weaving. This also meant that there was a growing internal market, because these wefts of Indonesian women were not meant for the world market, but there was a large indigenous market for these nice fabrics that these women made. In China, historians have discovered similar patterns, with young women in the early 20th century losing work as hand spinners, but taking up hand weaving in the context of growing monetization and demand for cloth in the countryside. A similar expansion of hand weaving with the rise of imports of yarn from Western Europe we see in India, although hand weaving here was much more urban, full-time, and a male-dominated phenomenon. So, in sum, although in the global periphery did see textile industries decline, the role of women in handloom weaving and cloth dyeing during the first decades of the 20th century can hardly be underestimated. Indigenous fabrics were able to cater to niche markets at least until the First World War, when the Japanese factories quickly took over an important share of the world market for textiles. And this means the final blow to handicraft production in the global south, Act 3. Following the philosophy of colonialism, most imperial powers were very reluctant to mechanize and industrialize their overseas territories, which they regarded in the first place as producers of the increasingly wanted tropical commodities and as markets for their own industrial goods, including textiles. Nevertheless, the British already made serious attempts at industrialization of the Indian subcontinent from the mid-1800s onwards. As mentioned before, the workers that were drawn to such factories, as you can see here, in textile centers such as Bombay and Ahmedabad, were predominantly male migrants from the countryside. Women usually stayed behind to do rural work, and because their migration was heavily restricted within the patriarchal society they lived in. As opposed to what happened in late 19th century, early industrializing China and Japan, the modern textile industry thus led to a masculinization of production in the case of British India. In Japan, on the other hand, the main labor force initially consisted of low-paid unmarried girls who were sent away from the countryside by their parents to work for a few years in the factories. They generally received very low wages and slept in dormitories, which further drove down their payment because it was seen as a compensation in kind. The combination of capital investments in the factory and the very, very cheap female labor employed there was key to the competitiveness of Japanese textile in the world market. And particularly during the First World War, when the capacity of the industries in Europe and the US was seriously disturbed, Japan managed to take over. In the 5-year period between 1914 and 1919, the total value of Japanese exports almost tripled, from a little over 500 million yens to 1.5 billion yens. Jumping into the temporary vacuum the Great War left in the world market for textiles, Japan exported its cheap cotton to markets all over Asia and as well as East Africa. And I found in the archives that even Belgians in the Congo were concerned about the impressive rise of imports of Japanese cotton factories in their colony. After the First World War, Japan managed to hold on to its share in the world market, and especially in the 1930s, they became of great concern to the Western powers. In colonial Indonesia, for instance, where the Dutch had always been very, very reluctant to invest in mechanized cotton production, the 1930s constituted a break. As the Japanese yen was already devaluated in 1931, whereas the Dutch guilder remained linked to the gold standard until 1936, the relative price of Japanese textiles became even lower than before. At first, the Dutch tried to prevent the flooding of the Indonesian market with cotton cloth from Japan by import tariffs, but after a few years they decided to introduce textile factories in the colony itself as a form of import substitution. Like in India, the emergence of mechanized industry also radically changed the gender division of labor in textile production in Indonesia. Whereas handloom weaving had traditionally almost entirely been the domain of women, the factories drew a lot of male laborers on a large scale. Although Japanese factories did employ women as wage workers, they formed a minority of 25%, so the rest was all male. As had happened in Europe decades before, the massive imports by Japan, as well as the setup of indigenous textile factories, also resulted in many married women in large parts of Asia losing their side employment in textile industry. As there were hardly any alternative opportunities for women outside subsistence agriculture, though, it is highly likely that this did not improve their position in society compared to men. As a result of the outcome of the Second World War, Japanese industrial competition was ruled out for a while. This meant that the Western textile industries were in principle able to regain their share in the world market. After overcoming the first problems of shortages in raw materials and lowered consumer demands, it appeared that the textile industries in Western Europe recovered in the early 1950s. So in the immediate post-war era, it was even difficult to find sufficient workers, because the textile factories in many countries were notorious for their relatively bad working conditions and low payment, again, the cheap labor. So working class people increasingly preferred jobs in other industries. On top of that, girls in the West increasingly followed more years of education, which meant that they were less available to work in factories from a young age, compared to before the Second World War. All these issues with the supply of labor forced entrepreneurs to offer more attractive working conditions. But this, of course, led to a steady rise in wages in Western textile factories. Another option was hiring guest workers from the Mediterranean in northwestern Europe, and they were for a period of time also attracted to work in textile production. On top of that, the economic uptick in the late 1950s resulted in higher nominal wages all over the economy, so also in the textile industry. And additionally, the development of the welfare state also entailed all sorts of additional employment benefits which employers had to pay. So the wage bill became seriously high. These factors combined led to a significant increase of the wage bill for employers. As a consequence, the newly industrializing countries in Eastern Europe and Asia, where wages were much lower and the union demands usually repressed, started to outcompete textile firms in Western Europe and the US. And this went gradually, as you can see. It's not in the 70s still Western Europe and the United States were very much leading, but they lost this dominance to Eastern Europe first, and later, after 1980, to Asia. So this meant that in the 1960s, many textile factories in the West, in the US and in Western Europe, started to get into serious trouble. Their output lowered and employment opportunities drastically declined, leading to massive layoffs and later also to the closure of many companies. During the 1970s, 1 million jobs in the Western European textile industry disappeared. That's really significant. Particularly the firms where basic production processes took place, such as spinning and weaving, had been relocated to low-wage countries. As this table shows, yarn production was the first to move, and many spinning mills had to close. Although this certainly led to distress in many regions where textile production was concentrated, and both male and female textile workers in the West protested against the shutdown of the firms, but the textile industry had become a relatively unimportant sector, usually in the whole economy, and usually it was only a regional phenomenon, so there was not much political clout of keeping these companies open. Also, exactly because of the rise of mass education that I mentioned earlier, many women chose alternative employment opportunities that were higher skilled or had more attractive labor conditions, for instance, office work or work in retailing. Meanwhile, circumstances elsewhere in Europe were quite different. Between 1950 and 1980, despite the communist regimes, loans from the USA and Western Europe allowed countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, to expand its textile industry. This region became an important player on the world market, as we've seen in the table, for textiles in the post-war period. The great majority of textile workers in Eastern Europe consisted of female laborers. They worked under such deplorable conditions that the generally not so militant staff of textile factories went on strikes multiple times in the post-war period. And in 1981, when the cost of living in Poland had risen so dramatically that the poor wages of textile workers led basically to starvation, many mothers, women joined the hunger marches organized by the trade union Solidarność, which was soon after forbidden. All in all, it is clear that the decades after the Second World War, in the decades after the Second World War, the Western dominance in worldwide cotton textile production started to erode. Many basic processes, such as spinning and weaving, were eventually outsourced to countries where wages were much lower, in first instance, Eastern Europe. This was much to the detriment of usually female textile workers who could barely survive on their poor wages. However, even cheaper regions of production came to the fore, most notably Asia, which was soon to become the predominant exporter of cotton, yarns, and textiles. From the early 1960s, East Asian economies quickly became a popular destination of international capital, seeking more favorable conditions for its production. Industries which catered to the demands of multinational companies and export markets, such as textiles, were speedily established in the countries formerly known as the Asian Tigers, such as South Korea, which you can see there on the top left, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, followed by Malaysia, Thailand, and a bit later, Indonesia. Unlike in Latin America, in Asia there has been a highly visible rise in the employment of young female workers. But these factories often made use of pre-industrial family relations for the recruitment of industrial laborers. In Taiwan, for example, family members, relatives, and others recruited through family and kinship networks formed the core labor force in small factories. So women were recruited via their families. And this actually allowed for the continuation of patriarchal domestic relations also on the work floor, which contributed to a lower payment for women. While this cheap labor situation may have been fortunate for entrepreneurs, it was less profitable for the female workers involved. In fact, also the current-day female textile workers of the third world probably encounter even more insecurities than the already precarious position of their 19th century Western counterparts. Whereas a century ago, the female textile workers in Lowell in the US or Lancashire in the UK produced largely for national firms, nowadays workers in the global south work for multinational companies which are only interested in the lowest wage bill and don't feel much intrinsic pressure to provide better working conditions. Instead, if the cost of labor rises too much, they might just as well relocate their production to a country with even lower wages. Much of this has its roots in international agreements that were made at a time when the economic hegemony of the USA was at its peak. In the beginning of the 1960s, when the US saw textile production disappear to low-wage countries in Asia, it instigated a series of agreements that were intended to restrict imports of cotton textiles, for instance from China, into the US. In 1974, this bilateral agreements culminated in the multi-fiber agreement, which was adopted not only by the US, but also by the European community, in order to constrain the competition from low-wage countries on their domestic textile industries. However, some countries were notably excluded from this multi-fiber agreement, such as Bangladesh. Ironically, such exceptions induced more volatility and insecurity for women workers in low-wage countries. Multinational enterprises would more readily move to regions that were exempt from the international agreements, leading to unemployment. Also, they would refrain from investing in favorable working conditions. The collapse of textile factory buildings around Rana Plaza in Dhaka in April 2013 is a very extreme consequence of such economization on the work environment. And well, it's a tragic image, but what I like about the image is that the cloth was used to help people really get out of there, and it's a very strong image, I think. Although unemployment and bad working conditions affect not only women in the textile industry, but male workers as well, I do believe that women are much more vulnerable because they are usually working in the lowest skilled position that are most prone to being dislocated. Also, it's usually men who work in management positions, so women have also less say about which jobs are being retained and which are not. Finally, alternative job opportunities for laid-off workers in many low-wage countries are often much scarcer for women than for men, also because of their lower level of education. In conclusion, throughout the centuries, the division of labor in the textile industry has been influenced by three important factors. First, market exchange and globalization were vital game changers. Under the influence of forces of supply and demand and specialization, textile production was taken out of the home and moved into the market. Regardless of whether this market was regional or global, we see men taking over the more profitable, higher value-added processes of textile production, and that they often organized in professional organizations such as guilds and later unions, which sometimes excluded women, also from formal training. Second, technological change often led to changes in the division of labor between men and women. For instance, when mechanization occurred during the Industrial Revolution, for the first time in history, men entered massively into spinning, a job that had traditionally, all over the world, mostly been performed by women. Different stages of industrialization led to different divisions of labor. So it's not a unilinear thing, I think. The first spinning machines, for instance, were often operated by women and men alike, and also often by children. In the course of industrialization, when the machinery became more productive and fewer people were needed, women were often replaced by men to tend to the machines. In Asia, we see quite differentiated patterns of gender division with industrialization.